best practices can joint water management be a catalyst for regional cooperation or even integration? And to what extent can regional bodies provide necessary frameworks or impulses in cross-border water management? I just listened to the last controversial debate whether SAARC is able to deal. In the meantime, I would say the European Union is, of course, dealing with water issues. We have the Water Framework Directive, the basic law for water management, where the river basin concept was created. So to look on water, not on the river, but on the river basin. And that, of course, in that little Europe goes very often beyond national borders. We have, by very painful experience of water pollution, the good water status that all member states have obliged to engage. And it is in 2015 that by the law we should have good water status. So we have, of course, an implementation deficit, and it will not be done everywhere. But this common framework, this Water Framework Directive, helped a lot and created investments, billions of investments in water sanitation systems. Another point, of course, when we had the huge flooding early the 90s, 91, 92, when along the Rhine River and the Maas, French say Meuse River, cities disappeared. We then as well had policies and requirements for all member states of the EU to do something for avoiding flooding with all what you can do there. So there is a lot on the way, and we will hear some cases today. I have an extinguished panel here. Paulo, Canelas de Castro, Mr. Eric Tilman, Dr. Mallika Joseph, and Dr. Nishal Naspande. I hope I spelled that halfway good. Yeah, then we start with a case between Portugal and Spain. I actually live on the Mosel River, opposite to Schengen, so on the border to Luxembourg and France. So I have a concrete river in front of my town. The Mosel comes from France, goes to Luxembourg and Germany, and goes in the Rhine River. But now we have a case between Portugal and Spain, and Paulo Canelas de Castro will tell us what has been done. He is president of the European Union Studies Association Asia Pacific, and among many other functions. So you start with your presentation, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, I would first like to congratulate the organization and the two institutions for this indeed very timely issue. I've been following water matters for a number of years. I've been participating in negotiations in many parts of the world. And indeed, I believe that it is very important to compare experiences, possibly to try to replicate a little bit the lessons drawn in other parts of the world. Now, I have not spoken with the organization on the reasons which led them to invite me to talk on the Portuguese-Spanish case, but I do believe that there is a good case, so to say, for going into that. In the European context, the Portuguese-Spanish case features particular characteristics which may be of importance to other parts of the world. It is, in a certain sense, a unique case. And this we can start to look at by merely looking at this slide. You come to realize that most of the shared rivers between Portugal and Spain originate in Spain and eventually go into Portugal and from there to the ocean. This is the most difficult kind of cases that you can imagine. Not contiguous rivers, but rather successive rivers, where there is one upstream state and one downstream state. One upstream state, which on top of all is in many ways more powerful than the downstream state, where the downstream state doesn't really have, in that regard, anything to exchange, so to say, if it goes only on a purely reciprocal basis. And indeed, this was the way you typically address these kind of cases. Apart from a very small stretch in the most southern river shared, Portugal is always the the downstream state. There are other factors which make this case unique, I believe. By looking at figures, you immediately realize that if indeed the key is a key of numbers, Spain has a lot to ask for in terms of water sharing. In terms of the rain which originates the river, most of the rain happens in Spain. Most of the economic development is concentrated in Spain. If these are the factors to be considered, and these were some of the traditional factors to be considered in these equations, Portugal would have what lawyers, and I am a lawyer, would call a bad case. Spain has also invested a lot in terms of storage capacity, in terms of, in a certain sense, addressing some of the problems which indeed are typical of, let's say, this particular area of the world. Because in this particular area of the world, to make things worse, water, which is actually relatively abundant in comparison with other areas of Europe, has a lot of variability. It comes in the wrong space at the right time. Dr. Paulo has said it, that we were used to see huge floods, but we are also used to problems of scarcity, of droughts, of situations very difficult. Not only at national level, but also in an intra-national level. There are some regions which are what in, let's say, old parlance we would call water-rich areas, where most of the other regions, particularly in the south, are water-poor areas, which of course calls for the temptation of diverting waters from one place to the other and try thereby to find some kind of balance. Is this the solution? So indeed, many reasons to look at the Luso-Spanish experience. Many reasons which have to do, I would say, mostly with imbalances, and imbalances which aggravate one trend which used to be characteristic of this bilateral setting, which was one of isolationism, each one by itself, that had also to do with the political options of the countries for a long time. One political leader in Portugal used to say, proudly alone. And indeed, proudly alone, the two countries were in terms of water governance and water management for many decades. And this was even enshrined in legal terms. Because one of the interesting characteristics of Portugal and Spain, nonetheless, is the fact that irrespective of these trends, they managed to pass treaties over different times on water issues. In a sense, they were even pioneers in doing so. The treaty started already in the midst of the 19th century. Basically, we went through, firstly, a political phase to draw boundaries, to use waters as instances of drawing boundaries, and eventually we moved on towards addressing economic issues. But another important feature of this setting, which I believe is important, is that irrespective of having treaties, most of these treaties were minimal, and there was poor implementation, non-compliance, and the institutions which were set up were mostly ineffective. In a certain sense, you resonate some of the key speeches, very interesting speeches I heard this morning by other distinguished speakers. So two main features, I would say, two main characteristics which make the Portuguese and the Spanish case different from the typical European one. Scarcity issues, you don't have scarcity problems as such, let's say, in the middle of Europe. You have pollution problems more typically, more so than scarcity issues, and certainly issues of governance. What is the right institution? What are the right procedures to address these problems? These treaties I told you about had a number of features which are important to be retained. I would say that the buzzword is that they were limited. They had a very narrow scope. by every criterion you may look at. Geographical scope. Most of these treaties concentrated on boundary waters. What intervened upstream, what intervened downstream, it was not the object of the treaty. In most of the cases, the two states would just pledge basically that at the boundary, certain goals would be attained. For the rest, each one was entitled to do by itself. And what was it, let's say, the legal discipline at the boundary? Basically, some entitlement to some development projects. Basically, authorizations to, for instance, erect a dam, for instance, to draw some waters for irrigation purposes. No consideration whatsoever of what we would these days call environmental implications, not to say the ecological impacts. As to the subjective scope, it was only a dealing purely between governments, between the two states. There was no consideration whatsoever of other actors. As for the time, a very legalistic view, I am afraid to say, as a lawyer, what you do in law is all that matters. But we would forget, of course, the implications in terms of time. We would forget that more so than legal entitlements, we are discussing water management, administration of these legal entitlements over time. There was no key solution for that. And basically, the law itself was minimal. It was basically a ratification of the negotiations, whatever their contents, whatever their fairness. Now, things started to change. And things started to change basically when an event took place. As lawyers, we usually recall that law changes when there are big events which take place. The Romans, which were the best lawyers on earth, used to say, "Jus oritur ut scandala evenient." Law changes when there are scandals which arise. What was the scandal here? What was the fact that triggered the change? It was basically a draft Spanish hydrological national plan which was put forward in '93. And when I mean put forward to the Spaniards, not to the counterparts, the Portuguese, which basically proposed that indeed some waters from the north, and in particular the big river in the north, the Douro, would be diverted just before coming to the border, just before reaching Portugal, in a zigzag to the southeast to irrigate the Gulf camps in southeast Spain. And of course, this provoked an immense outcry, an immense emotion, an immense commotion in Spain itself, because indeed there were issues of equity in the sharing of waters between the different regions. And we know that Spain has a particular constitutional setting, which is not easy in that regard with the autonomies, but of course in Portugal. And the same kind of belligerent discourse that we heard of in relation to South Asia took place in Portugal. Very eminent politicians, I'm not going to quote the names, very prominent politicians in Portugal almost promised a kind of holy war. They promised for sure to go upwards the Douro and to settle the problem against the Spaniards. Of course, things cooled down after a while, but this gives you a sense of the sensitivity of this issue. There was for sure the perception that the old model was outmoded, that the old model was outdated, and that a new experiment should be done at something. Now, the target was for a while very uncertain. But basically, the two countries decided that they would engage in negotiations aiming at a treaty, aiming at settling the issue. Law is important in these matters. After some hesitations, the two agreed basically on a solution, an institutional design which actually proved to be very useful and which I'd stand to submit may have some implications also as to the design of institutions in other parts of the world. A right mix of different skills, of different competencies to address these problems. These problems do have a diplomatic dimension. They do have a diplomatic dimension, and in that sense it is important to have a diplomatic representative, also as a means to introduce in the table other topics which may work as a kind of trade-off, because we should not look at things in isolation. Water issues are indeed important. They are cross-cutting in many senses, but there are in addressing these problems possibilities of finding win-win solutions, sometimes with other resources, sometimes with other capacities in the countries. Of course, a very strong hydrological knowledge representation, very prominent engineers were engaged into the process, but also lawyers. I would submit, not because I'm a lawyer, but I do believe that lawyers have this capacity of, in a certain sense, reducing complexity by showcasing the right concepts which may polarize the different solutions for this problem. Now, in Portugal and in Spain, this was done in a threefold way. On the one hand, a team working inside the country, which would bring in the best specialists, then these three representatives in the negotiating team, and of course it is vital for this, a very strong and ongoing political backing and leadership, not least with some internationalization, not least with repercuting some messages to the exterior, and the exterior, or I would say the interior, in this case, was of course the European community, the European Union afterwards. Now, positions have evolved, but it is interesting to see a little bit how they basically were characterized, because they are typical of this kind of opposition between upstream countries and downstream ones. The Spanish position was very much one focused on quantity issues, and nothing but quantity issues, on transfers, on reciprocal dealings, where what I do, what I give, you give me back in a certain sense. Tit for tat, you have to, in a certain sense, exchange, for instance, quantities. But what about if you don't have anything to exchange? They had, nonetheless, one very important innovative factor, which has to do with their own administrative experience. They claimed that it would be important to introduce a basin approach. And with that, they gave opening for the Portuguese position, which was much broader in sense. It basically preached an integrated water resources management. What is it about the integrated water resources management? For once, that you have to bring in all kinds of matters which are related with management. Not only quantity, but also quality in an environmental perspective. And this has to be really translated into the goals, and the convention that we eventually adopted is one which reads Convention on Cooperation for the Protection and Sustainable Development. The usage idea becomes one of sustainability, sustainable development of the waters of the Luso-Spanish rivers. The other one is indeed an environmental option, bringing nature in. It goes about waters in all their complex relations, surface waters together with groundwaters, fresh waters together with coastal waters and their implications, and this gives rise for the Portuguese to claim some numbers in terms of waters which otherwise they wouldn't. And ecosystems. It is important indeed to realize that waters, as such, systems are the basis for life, and this has implications in terms of let's say, the obligations which are enshrined. Impacts, environmental objectives, protection, a whole new area which comes with that. Also very important that the perspective of the dealing is not only about two states in static positions, but rather that they have to relate in a very intimate way. And not only that, they have to give opening to other actors to intervene. And this has been reflected in the case of the later adopted institution between Portugal and Spain, that there is a subcommission for basically listening to what all stakeholders may have to say about these matters. because it is indeed important to realize that water touches everybody, and that sometimes the most important knowledge is disseminated. It's not the bureaucrats in the capitals who really know about the water, but sometimes the peasant next to a certain stretch of the river who knows when the discharges of the factory intervene and with what consequences, and this has to be brought into a system of knowledge and sharing of information, which is important. By the way, much more than the substantive solutions, procedures are the key. It is important indeed to realize that these disciplines are not finished by passing of the treaty, they are only started by passing the treaty. The treaty is the starting point, but it has to evolve. It has to evolve with conditions, it has to evolve with information which shall be collected, and for these procedures have to be set up. Institutions and procedures are, I would submit, some of the most important features of viable treaties, treaties which are really going to work. And then to do all this in the shadow, as I usually say, of law, law being in this sense a representation of expectations of people. It was very important that the Portuguese, at the very same time they were negotiating this treaty, starting, in a certain sense, intervening in other fora, at the regional level, for sure, in the European Union, but also at the United Nations level. There was a talk this morning on a reference to the United Nations Convention, which was adopted in '97. Well, we went for it, and we went for it as a means of precisely trying to replicate our own ideas and have, let's say, the ideas of a global consciousness coming on board into these matters. I realize that my time is done. I would just stretch one idea, precisely which has to do with time. It is important to realize that in water management, time is of the essence, that indeed procedures, actors, even the criteria have to be dealt in a long time. It goes about sustainable development and not really about developments in a particular fraction of time only. And with this, I would stop. Thank you very much, Chair.
Yeah, Professor Paulo Canelas de Castro, thank you very much for this most interesting case of conflict management and water management between Spain and Portugal. Nearly a holy war, you could imagine, in the 90s, a holy war, which was avoided by political will at the end and as well by a new treaty. And in fact, this was then a motivation for Portugal to go to other institutions like the United Nations and present this form of solution. Now, in fact, very interesting, but I fear we ran out of a lot of time if other cases are as intensively presented. So I invite Erik Tilman, founder and administrator of River Network, to give us the presentation on the Mekong basin experiment and the role and potential of ASEAN cooperation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I am actually an engineer, so I think I should be one of the only engineers in this assembly. So I just the opportunity to say that sometimes maybe it's good also to associate engineer to the political decision and the legal decision. And also I will speak about a river which is not part of what you include in the South Asia. It's the Mekong basin, which is more in east, but with the same source, which is the Himalaya mountains. So it means that Mekong has Indus, Ganga, and other rivers going to Central Asia are from the same source, which is under threat, and it's certainly one of the most sensitive regions in the world in terms of climate change. So the Mekong River Basin may be divided into, let's say, two portions. One which is called the Upper Mekong Basin, and this river is called Lanka River in China. And this is actually the portion of the Mekong who belongs to China. And the lower Mekong Basin starts at the border of China, and actually the Mekong basin includes 6 countries: China, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar, and Vietnam. So I just need my glasses because it's a little bit small.
Yeah.
So China is clearly the upstream country. Myanmar has a very small area in the Mekong. The Mekong Basin in Myanmar is only a small area of the country, and then you have Laos, which is a middle country, Thailand as well, and Vietnam, which is both a middle country and downstream country. Some figures very quickly. So the river is 4,000 kilometers long, 4,800 kilometers long, and nearly 800,000 square kilometers. What is important is that the upper part of the Mekong contributes to something like between 15 and 30% of the total flow in the Mekong, according to the different season, wet season or dry season. And what is very important in the Mekong is that in the lower part of the Mekong, you have a huge lake, which is called Tonle Sap. And the regime of the Mekong affected a lot the Tonle Sap lake, which is the richest lake in freshwater fish in the world. And what makes the particularity of the Mekong is that up to recently, and I hope it will last, the second most biodiverse river in the world after the Amazon. And this river supports the largest freshwater fish with about 2.3 million tons per year. So that's we have to keep in mind because it's a very important point in the discussion on this river. So again, some figures is 60 million people and 39% of the population live in Thailand and 20 in Vietnam. And what is also a feature of the Mekong is that it remains mainly a basin which includes a huge amount of rural population, which is 85% of the basin. So it's still the rural area remains very important in the Mekong. So the country's perspective, if we see the importance of the Mekong according to the countries, we can see that in China, Mekong is a very, very small portion of the territory. And so China, for China, Mekong is to a certain extent a marginal river. For Laos, it's nearly all the country included in the Mekong, so Mekong is very important for Laos. The same for Cambodia. For Myanmar, it's also very marginal. For Thailand, let's say that Mekong has its importance, but the most important river in Thailand is the Chao Phraya, which actually the heart of Thailand. And for Vietnam, of course, Mekong is very important because it's the life of nearly 20 million inhabitants in the delta with producing rice, and it's the most productive area in the world in rice. So the Mekong Delta is a very important area as well. So in terms of livelihoods and food security, let's say that actually a lot of people are still having their life depending on the fish production. And at the moment, of course, this area of the world is has a huge rate of economy improvement, even if Cambodia and Laos remain still under a certain level of poverty. The challenge at the moment in the Mekong is that, first of all, hydropower development is more and more attractive, and especially for Laos and China, of course, but China and Laos are the two countries, Vietnam a little bit less, who are actually just looking for hydropower development, and that can make a huge source of revenue for the country. Irrigation is quite important as well, especially for Thailand and Cambodia. We have also some issues of climate change, but that is things that you can understand, I think, in your countries as well. And the Delta is also vulnerable to this climate change issue. So that's the global perspective. In terms of regional economic integration, let's say that there are, three places where transboundary dialogue can start. One is just corresponding to the 6 countries of the Mekong, and it's called the Great Mekong Subregion. This is an Asian Development Bank initiative, and in this framework, some sectoral cooperation have been developed, mainly in terms of energy and transport, and also an important part of this program, mainly with some countries, some European countries active in the funding, is the Great Mekong Subregion Core Environmental Program, and they are quite focused on issues of forestation and conservation of biodiversity in the Mekong. Then you have the Mekong Basin country, the ASEAN. ASEAN is, let's say, on the starting blocks. I think there are quite a lot of progress in the ASEAN countries, but China is not part of the ASEAN. And then you have, let's say, the key for transboundary dialogue, which is the Mekong River Commission. And the Mekong River Commission actually is 4 countries of the Mekong. So it means that China and Myanmar never joined the Mekong River Commission, even if now China and Myanmar are observers in this commission. This commission has been created in 1995, let's say just after the war in Vietnam and the tension in Cambodia. So, the agreement for cooperation remains quite weak. It was a willingness to cooperate, but without, let's say, clear objective and clear monitoring. So this agreement is still in place at the moment. It has never been reviewed, and it's likely one of the weaknesses we will speak about later. So the country's perspective, let's say that China has a clear objective of developing hydropower, Laos as well. Thailand is mainly dealing with irrigation. Cambodia is also dealing with irrigation and fish production, and Vietnam also irrigation in the delta. So in China at the moment, there is an hydropower cascade which has been completed, and since that time now China is more keen to collaborate with the Mekong River Commission, but during the time the hydropower development was done, China never participated to the debate in the Mekong. And the hydropower in China have some significant redistribution of the flow during between the wet and the dry season, which is still limited because China, as I said, is only 15 to 30% of the Mekong flow. So let's say that because the time is short, I think I will just present the hot topic in the Mekong. The hot topic is hydropower development. This is the major things we are speaking about now. And let's say the opportunities of hydropower development is, of course, benefits from the electricity production. We can think about the reduction of flood damage, but this is under the condition that the cascade of dam is well managed. Otherwise, it will be the reverse. And they say also that we can have an increased production of reservoir fishery, but of course, this fish will be less quality and also not necessarily sustainable. So the risk is mainly the issues of fish migration, which make that apparently many studies have shown that the production of fish can be affected very, very significantly, and even at the same, in terms of trade-off, the economic benefit of hydro production can be at least can be something like equivalent to the loss in fish production. So, so the strengths and weaknesses in regional cooperation. So, as I said, we have the ASEAN, but China is not member. And at the moment, ASEAN has not particularly addressed the water issues. The GMS constitute a good dialogue between the countries. But of course, GIS is not necessarily sustainable because it's supported by ADB, and the future of GMS is not necessarily ensured. And the Mekong River Commission is still very weak, and decisions are not big decision like the Xayaburi Dam in Laos, for instance, has been decided unilaterally by Laos without the agreement of the Mekong River Commission countries. So, in terms of water governance in the Mekong River, so the legal framework is not harmonized between the Mekong countries, and that's a problem. And the institutional framework, which could allow the sector and the countries to speak each other, is under implementation, but very rarely operational. And we have a huge problem of lack of transparency in sharing data and information. Even between the sectors in the countries, but of course between the countries themselves, this is a huge handicap for decision support. By the end also, the consultation and involvement of stakeholders and civil society is still very weak in some of the countries, and a lot of progress has been done in other countries, but this is still a very weak point. So, in short, that's the last slide. Let's say that progress in developing water governance and regional cooperation are substantial, but it's often considered as very slow in comparison with the pace of development. So we have very important decisions which have been taken in terms, for instance, of hydropower development to respond to the increasing demand, but at the same time, the water governance and the tool for regional cooperation are not set up. So we have the impression sometimes that decisions are taken a little bit without enough, let's say, reflection about the impacts at regional level. So the very odd topics to be tackled in the Mekong, it's hydropower, competition for land and water use, and this is a potential source of conflict. The positive point is that the global world makes that the civil society is getting more and more attentive to the concept of sustainable development. And I think that this is important to associate the young people and, let's say, the civil society to respond also to these problems. And there are also some numerous spots where new approach for better management of water resource conservation are taken. In Thailand, for instance, now you have huge efforts to to make better conservation of forestry and biodiversity, and this is also a good starting point. So, thanks.
Yeah, Eric Tilman, thanks a lot. Highly interesting example, the Mekong River, 6 countries, 60 million people, a lot of different interests, hydropower, fishing, agriculture, and interesting that they are quite young in their cooperation. 95 is not so long ago. And despite you're an engineer, you recognize that you need the lawyers, because without a legal framework that is harmonized, you will not settle the conflict. So we need the engineers, but we need the lawyers, can I say myself, because I'm a lawyer as well. Very good. Thank you very much. Then let's move to Dr. Mallika Joseph, Executive Director, Center for Strategic Studies in Colombo, Sri Lanka. And you will give us a few more inputs on water management as a main issue for cooperation, please.
Thank you, Chair. Let me start by thanking the Konrad Stiftung as well as the South Asia Democratic Forum for having provided us this opportunity to discuss a very important subject, very important for South Asia itself. Two questions.
Can you switch because the camera doesn't catch you, so you are lost in our documentation of this important. Just come here. Up. Yeah. Ça va? Très bien. And
No, I don't have a presentation.
so it's okay.
Thank you. So thank you for the opportunity. And the principal question that I was asked to address was, can joint water management be a catalyst for regional integration in South Asia? And for that, anyway, it's a self-serving question. The simple answer is yes. Water management can indeed be an effective channel for developing greater regional cooperation, as has been witnessed by the 2 presentations that preceded mine, to what water management can do for the region. I think the same can be expected from South Asia itself. One thing which I want to start off the presentation with is, despite the potential for dispute in international basins, the record of acute conflict over international water resources is historically overwhelmed by the record of cooperation. So I think there is some good news there. The last 50 years have seen only 37 acute disputes, those involving violence, while during the same period, 157 treaties have been negotiated or signed. Progress in cooperation on shared river management can enable and catalyze benefits beyond the river, and I think that's one main reason why regional integration is so much positive outcome of joint river management. And it can have direct linkages in forward linkages in the economy, and less directly through diminished tensions and improved relationships. For example, the forward linkages, what I'm talking about is, for example, in food and energy production and trade, and which are relatively obvious. Agricultural surpluses may spur growth in agro-processing or trade. Enhanced hydropower production and interconnection could both expand productive opportunities and increase the profitability and competitiveness of existing power-using enterprises. This may lead to additional investments in industry or infrastructure and strengthen trade relations. Investments, improved infrastructure networks, and trade relations can in turn generate additional growth opportunities, and so on. So these are something which are very vital for South Asia, and the potential for river water management and regional integration is pronounced in these aspects. South Asia, as you know, is the least integrated regions in the world, primarily because narrowly defined nationalist and statist considerations of security have divided South Asia rather than bring them together. And I think Subha's presentation in the morning amply exemplified some of the challenges and also this security agenda, securitization of the water agenda and what it's led. The narrow status considerations of security hold true when considering water management as well. India and Pakistan have disputes over sharing the waters of the Indus. India and Bangladesh have disputes over the Teesta River. India and Nepal have disputes over the Kosi River. Furthermore, there are various subnational disputes in water management, which again was brought out between the problem between Karnataka and Tamil Nadu over the Kaveri River. However, the increasing scarcity of water and the degradation of existing water sources throughout the region are posing grave security challenges itself. Things like global change, the receding Himalayan glaciers, they have caused more volatility in water supply to the three major river basins in South Asia, the Indus, Ganges, and Brahmaputra. This, I think, provides enough impetus for the countries in the region to come together. And also, in addition to the environmental issues, the human activity within the region, the unplanned increased urbanization has resulted in lowering of water tables and the degradation in water sources itself. Added to that, you do have a lot of studies which talk about impending water stress and water insecurities that are going to happen in the region. The UNESCAP reports that by 2065, water availability per capita in India alone would have fallen by 1/3. 2012 ADB report identified Pakistan as one of the most water-stressed countries in the world. Its emergency water reserves would only last for 30 days, in contrast to 1,000 days for countries with similar climates. Bangladesh faces a serious problem of contamination of groundwater due to arsenic, and the reports say nearly 20 million people are at risk. So given the drastic nature of such looming threats to environment security, South Asia as a whole faces drastic imperative to build a regional institutional framework for water management. This indicates that cooperation on water management might just be the first effective foundation for greater South Asian integration. In addition to these complications, we also have a threat of exploitation of water in the region by China. China is also interested in harnessing the potential of the Himalayan rivers, such as the Brahmaputra, for hydropower, which would severely interrupt the flow of water into the Indian subcontinent. The imperative of responding to this threat would also drive the South Asian nations towards greater cooperation. Moving on to the different kind of institutional frameworks that formally and informally exist within the region. Most of the institutional frameworks that currently exist are almost exclusively in the form of bilateral mechanisms. The Indus Water Treaty between India and Pakistan, the Mahakali Water Treaty between India and Nepal are prominent examples. And despite that, there have been some regional initiatives, the sub-regional one which was pointed out, which exists between India, Bangladesh, Nepal, India, Bangladesh, and Bhutan. So those are some of the trilateral measures that have come about. Those are positive measures. A key feature of this sub-regional initiative is that India, the most powerful of the Troika, is giving serious stamp of approval to the formation of a joint working group on equitable use of water and hydropower, the agreement which will also look at augmenting capacities for water use. The joint committee that is envisaged by the three countries will bring together the respective ministries of water, power, and foreign affairs. The committee will also be aided by senior technical experts. Thus, there's a confluence of and coordination between several key ministries as well as between political actors and bureaucrats in this initiative. At the same time, there is also an initiative in the offing between Bangladesh, India, and Bhutan to enhance cooperation on sharing of waters of the Brahmaputra. While even such initiatives took a long time to develop, considering that South Asia has been independent of colonial rule for more than 60 years, it is possible to argue that cooperative arrangements on water sharing might be able to go the extra mile that trade agreements and foreign policies have not been able to do so far. In the realm of trade and political alignment, the South Asian nations traditionally have well-established networks, even something which exists beyond the region. And they do not essentially rely on a regional framework. For example, in the sphere of trade, the legacy of colonial rule has led to individual South Asian nations developing similar economic structures and primarily being exporters to extra-regional markets. Even the impressive economic growth and modernization of India has not completely offset this trend. In the terms of political alignment, India's status within the region has led to the other South Asian nations also working together and forming closer relationship with extra with other powers, extra-regional powers. However, when it comes to the issue of water resources, South Asian nations do not have any such extra-regional networks or alignments to which they can rely on. And one other major factor is there is no major extra-regional water sources that a South Asian nation could draw on without incurring considerable costs. So therefore, my principal argument is that the cheapest option, the best option, both economically as well politically, would be to develop a regional framework for water sharing. Regional bodies can also lay down effective frameworks for cross-border water management to the extent that they focus on developing technical capabilities in real-time information sharing and monitoring. Access to data and effective decision-making tools have been regularly named as critical to building institutional capacity as well as confidence building. Here I have the example of the South African Development Community through 2012 and 2013 with the support from the GIZ Trans-Border Water Management in SADC program. SADC Water Division embarked on a project to develop a system to support sharing of vital water-related information across the South African region. So I think that's something, the information sharing becomes very critical to enhancing cooperation. Therefore, the development of an integrated data bank on water flows within the region would help immensely, since a lot of the conflict over water management has risen from unilateral, uninformed extraction from or release of water into the river system by one of the state parties concerned. But there is a flip side to a regional mechanism or a regional framework as well, which I think some of it was highlighted in the morning's session. The flip side of it, of regional bodies in the question of water management is water sharing arrangements often end up hidden from the public because these are being negotiated by the state itself, resulting in democratic deficit relating in the management of water. So that needs to be addressed. Furthermore, there is a distinct danger of regional bodies crowding out informal methods of water sharing among local bodies that have been present for a long time. Instead of incorporating their methods and knowledge, it is possible that the supranational institutions might simply sideline them, which has been the case in most places. This has happened in the case of water sharing in many regions, in conflict regions. In South Asia, there have been many such informal water sharing agreements between different local communities and polities. For example, in Sri Lanka, farmers from the Sinhalese and the Tamil communities have long had informal arrangements over water sharing, and such arrangements have even caught the attention of external observers as important CBMs in overcoming the conflict between these two ethnic communities. However, arrangements over water sharing that have been brokered by government institutions have often led to bitter conflict between the very same groups. Therefore, regional bodies can be successful in cross-border water management to the extent that they incorporate local knowledge and keep the public duly informed and engaged with developments in the water sharing arrangements. To conclude, I just have 3 points. Overall, there is much that suggests that water sharing can be a catalyst for regional integration, and that regional bodies themselves can offer impulses for cross-border water management, given that they are structured and act in a certain conducive way. Secondly, it is also worth mentioning that regional bodies themselves can only do so much with their own resources. So here we have a role for extra-regional powers, especially with the sharing of resources and technical expertise and financial resources of global actors, such as the World Bank, which are sometimes sorely needed for capacity building. Third and final point is, while the focus on water management in South Asia has so far focused on inland freshwater sources, there's considerable scope for cooperation on maritime resources as well. These have greater relevance for cooperation between India and its maritime neighbors, Sri Lanka and Maldives, and also bear great relevance to its relation with other South Asian countries such as Pakistan and Bangladesh. There is evidence of cooperation between India and Sri Lanka on oil exploration within Sri Lanka's territorial waters. In 2007, the Petroleum Resources Development Secretariat under the Sri Lankan President's Office launched the Mannar Basin licensing round for 3 exploration blocks in the Mannar Basin. The bids were evaluated by a technical evaluation committee and the cabinet-appointed negotiation committee, which selected one of the Indian companies as the winning bidder on the basis of work commitments and fiscal provisions of the bids. So this could be a starting point for cooperation itself. And one other example is also the joint group on fisheries, which has been established by Indian and Sri Lankan governments as a step towards reducing tension arising between the mutual encroachment on fish stocks. So I think there is possibility not only in the freshwater, but also in maritime resources to be considered. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mallika Joseph, for this interesting outlook how to cooperate in the regional level, regional framework for water management. When I was in Delhi and elsewhere, I always told the story that we started with a community of coal and steel after the Second World War to prevent conflicts and a new war. And I said, why not you have a community for water and energy? Because it is so much related, as we heard, hydropower and energy needs, water and energy. And you give us some ideas even to extend it from the rivers to the open seas, if you consider fishery and other oil drilling. There are lots of questions, and I think the stress will grow in the future if you then add climate change and all the effects it could have. I think cooperation is urgent and necessary. Yeah, then we move on to the next presenter, Dr. Nishal Nas Pandey, Director, Center for Strategic Studies. And you address as well the same issue, more or less, how can we cooperate in regional bodies.
Can see you, otherwise.
You can see you can't see him, so then we switch again.
Yes.
We don't want to lose any of our experts in the film we are doing. And,
Thank you, sir. I also don't have a PowerPoint. I think our chairman this morning is the power, and I have brought some points. I would like to thank at the outset the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, our friends Andrea and Tomislav, and Mr. Paulo Casaca of the South Asia Democratic Forum for this kind invitation to share some of my thoughts on the critical issue of water and cross-border management. Now, the issue of water, as far as Nepal is concerned, has many connotations. Number one, it is hydroelectricity. It is also drinking water. It is also flood control. It is also irrigation, and it is also border management. A single word can have very different meanings, and therefore, we have at least 7 ministries looking after water. And the moment when we say border management, all our rivers, most of our rivers are international boundary lines. These are international borders. The moment the river crisscrosses one's territory, the border changes. And therefore, the Ministry of Home becomes important in this regard. So therefore, the issue of water has many connotations. As Professor Delwar Hussain in the previous panel mentioned, Nepal has surplus water. And the capacity to generate hydropower is 83,000 megawatts, which is only second to Brazil in the world. But 83,000 megawatts is only to answer correctly to quiz contest questions. We have only managed to generate 700 megawatts, which is just about not even 1% of the total capacity. Nepal's elite political class holds the hydrodollar fallacy that just like the Arab countries can generate and become wealthy by generating oil, we can also become rich by exporting water or hydroelectricity. The problem is that water needs harnessing by building dams, while oil can be mined in one-time capacity. Water does not allow for surplus storage like oil in tanks that can be shipped and sold in different continents. Therefore, transmission lines become very important. Nepal also these days imports electricity from India during the winter. But the transmission lines are not properly developed. Therefore, I would suggest that transmission corridors should be given topmost priority, just like national highways that should be regarded as critical infrastructure development in our region. The second issue is investment. Hydropower development, especially cross-border management, demands huge investment. To attract that investment, the investor needs assurance of certain things, and number one is political stability and the assurance that state policy is not going to change overnight. Now, we are a nation which has had 19 prime ministers in 19 years. And if the investor feels that there is not going to be any stability of state policy towards his investment, he's not going to invest. Second is environmental concerns and the positive attitude of the local population where these huge dams are going to be built. And that has been quite problematic in the last few decades. And third, an integrated hydro policy and establishment of an independent electricity regulatory commission. Nepal has had huge political upheavals on the issue of treaties signed with India in the past, whether it is Koshi or Gandak in the 1950s, whether it is Mahakali Pancheshwar in the 1990s. Every major treaty signed on the issue of water with India has become controversial. And Nepali political leaders have failed each time to sell the agreement at the level of the common man. And the extreme left political parties excel on the art of making a huge controversy on the issue of our relations with India on the issue of water. And interestingly, these leaders have very good personal relations with their leftist leaders in India. So the other issue is the jingoistic nationalistic passion that sometimes we try to garner for vote bank politics on the issue of hydroelectricity projects. The fourth issue is of the independent regulator. The Nepal Electricity Authority is the government-owned authority that controls all aspects of power, whether it is generation, transmission, or distribution. And disagreement on pricing of power has become a formidable hurdle in power trading agreements between India and Nepal, largely because prices are not fixed on commercial purposes. In all this debate, can surplus hydropower be exported from Nepal to India and from Nepal to Bangladesh? The answer is yes. Only perhaps after the two countries have achieved commercial or political relationships similar to Norway and Germany. Almost 60% of the total population of Nepal, a population of 28 million, today does not have access to electricity. How can we export power to other countries? We are currently having 14 hours of daily power outage during the winter. We call it load shedding. Most of you in Europe do not even know what load shedding is. I told a friend of mine in Singapore that we have 14 hours of power shortage, and he said, "Wow, how romantic." You can have candlelight dinners every day. And the 40% of those in Nepal that have electricity, the demand is growing at a double-digit growth. Therefore, there needs to be a substantive agreement between Nepal and India, perhaps Nepal, India, Bangladesh, on development of hydropower in Nepal. It is a monopsony market. Please remember this word, monopsony, not monopoly. Monopoly is a term in a situation where there is only one producer. Monopsony is a case when there is only one buyer, only one consumer. So it's a monopsony market where there is only one buyer, and in this case it is only India. So the investor demands a good, stable relationship with India if he is going to invest billions and billions of dollars. The fifth question is, can the Bhutan model be replicated as regards to Nepal? And most people say that Bhutan is a success story because it is now the second richest country in South Asia. It has had very good relations with India on the case of hydropower. Most of its electricity is sold to India, and India buys this electricity at a very nominal cost. And the revenue that it generates makes Bhutan the second richest country. Firstly, the problem is Bhutan does not have the tarai to irrigate. The tarai is the plain lands. Bhutan does not have the tarai to irrigate. Therefore, flood control, irrigation, and border management are not critical questions for Bhutan, whereas it is for Nepal. India has given 60% grant and 40% soft loan for much of the projects in Bhutan. To replicate that model in Nepal, we will need a huge financial commitment from both the government and the private sector. And this is not possible at the moment because of political instability, because of confusion, because Nepal is the only country in South Asia which does not have a full-fledged constitution. We are the only country which does not have an elected parliament, an elected government, and elected local bodies. Some people cite the case of Iraq. At least it has an elected government. This is a case where there is no full-fledged constitution, no elected parliament, no elected government, no elected local elected bodies. So it's a complete vacuum from top to the bottom. And therefore, the issue of water is not a priority at the moment. And we do need to really study the case of India-Bhutan relationship on the case of hydropower, because even though the pricing is very minimal, I think they have sold the Chukha project for ₹1 per unit, which is very minimum. It has generated a capacity that Bhutan today can claim to be the second richest country in South Asia. And they can still advertise on the model of gross national happiness, primarily because it has done well for Bhutan. Finally, on the issue of South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, the regional organization that we have, it is the only regional organization in South Asia where all the 8 countries are members. Unfortunately, in 1985, it was established without a political or a security role. SAARC deliberately avoids contentious bilateral issues, but it needs to learn from ASEAN and the EU models, as it was just in this panel very well illustrated, presented on the EU and the ASEAN models. I think we in South Asia need to learn from how ASEAN and EU as organizations have dealt with water issues so successfully in these two regions. But you also in Europe must understand that in South Asia, the track 2, the civil society, the think tanks are more vibrant than perhaps in Europe and in ASEAN. The track 2 of South Asia are extremely vibrant and active platforms where you can engage with. And events such as this by the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung helps in cross-fertilization of ideas between various regional organizations and various regions in ASEAN, Europe, and South Asia. Honorable Sir, I would like to thank you very much.
Yeah, Dr. Nisha, thank you very much. I learned a lot that we have not only petrodollars, but we could have hydrodollars if the framework is good. And the monopsony as well, a new thing that I learned. In fact, India-Bhutan, it works, so why not India-Nepal and Nepal-Bangladesh? I mean, of course, the question of political will, of mutual esteem, of other hurdles like political stability. There's a lot of questions that are preconditions to explore the huge richness that Nepal inhabits, and can only wish that this will work in the next years. Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, we had 4 excellent presentations. I would say each of the presentation was excellent to show us the importance of cross-border cooperation in water management, and water is so existential that it could be done and should be done. Unfortunately, we have stressed our time limit by and large, and I would say any questions that arise from this should be then put in the afternoon, and I thank all the presenters for coming here and giving us this input. Now we break up for lunch, and then at 1 o'clock we continue the afternoon session. So thanks a lot, and I hope that this conference in Brussels could help to settle some of the issues, and I'm sure there must be and will be a follow-up, either here or in South Asia, to have progress in the right to water and the management of water. Thank you very much. The second panel is then closed.